Okay, hi. We're going to talk about pests and diseases today. In this presentation, let me share my screen. Here we go. And let's start the show. Okay, so we're going to talk about the various pests and diseases that plague the honeybee colonies, especially in Africa and more particularly in Nigeria. And for starters, what we're going to do is we're going to need to define the concept of requeening, because we're going to use that as a way to troubleshoot some of the issues that we are going to see with some of those diseases especially. So what is requeening? Requeening is basically to change the existing queen, take her out somehow and replace her with another queen that is going to be usually younger and or healthier. That's a way to troubleshoot problems of temperament with the colony when you have a colony that's too defensive and hard to manage, or when you have diseases and problems with weak colonies. Sometimes this can help. So there's two types of requeening in beekeeping. There's the first type of requeening is when the colony decides that they want to change their own queen, and the bees will take over and do that themselves on their own. So sometimes you're going to see what we call swarm cells, queen cells, because they're used either in swarming or replacement of the queen. So there's three main reasons the bees might want to requeen themselves. They might be wanting to swarm, which is the natural reproduction of the superorganism. And at that point, the old queen is going to leave the nests with a bunch of bees and leave behind several queen cells, a lot of brood, a lot of young nurse bees, a lot of food, and wax combs for the new queen to start with the best chances. But the old queen will live on her own. And when there's a excess of population and excess of food, that's usually when it starts. And when the colony swarms, typically there will be several queen cells. So you see these peanut-shaped cells that are not looking like the rest of the brood. They are hanging vertical instead of more horizontal, and they look like peanuts, especially when they're capped, closed, and when the queen is transforming inside. So in that case, this is due to excess food and population, and the reproduction cycle of the superorganism is going to push them to swarm. So those are called swarm cells. Another reason why colony might requeen themselves is when the bees or the queen will kill the old queen and they will need an emergency replacement. So usually it's when the bees decide that there's a problem with the queen. She's either sick or not performing well, or there's an issue. And so at some point they decide to change that queen. So they will kill the old queen and grow another queen from some of the eggs that they have in the colony. They'll do that themselves. And at that point, that's called supersedure, meaning they're putting a new queen in place of the old one, and that's superseding her. And usually you have only one or two cells, maybe two or three, and usually it's going to be in the center of a comb. And it's usually in colonies that might show signs of problems, low population or disease or some other issue. But sometimes we cannot really tell exactly why they're requeening themselves. They're superseding the old queen. And we just got to trust that they're doing this for a reason. But that colony is going to need to get watched, because that's usually a sign of a problem, and that requeening might not necessarily work very well. By the way, with swarming, these swarm cells can be used to do splitting, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So that's also why I wanted to mention the principles of swarm cells. And we'll talk about swarming and virgin queens in another session, but just know that usually if you let them sit there until the first queen emerges, she will kill all the other queens. And so you'll be left with only one queen. Excuse me. But you can harvest and cut these out, and we'll talk about that so that you can use it in other colonies. Okay, so that was swarming. This is supersedure. And then there's a third reason why a colony might requeen themselves is when they've got an emergency situation. The queen is either injured or dead and is unable to continue her function. She might have disappeared. The beekeeper might have rolled her or crushed her. Or when there was a split that was done, there was not the right conditions to grow a queen. Or when we're splitting without swarm cells, without the natural reproduction cycle, and we're forcing a split, emergency cells can happen. And in that point, the bees are kind of desperate to make a queen with whatever they've got. So it's going to be, they're going to be using eggs and very young larvae from the regular worker brood area, and they will take what it was originally a horizontal cell and stretch it out and bring it down to make it look like those peanut cells that you were looking at here. And that at that point, it's called an emergency. The reason it's an emergency is because without the queen for a long time, they will die. So they really have to try their best to grow another queen. Okay, so those are the basic principles of requeening by the bees. Now, sometimes the beekeeper can requeen for various reasons. The main ones being, you've got an overly defensive colony, which is very hard to manage when they're really mad all the time and they're really attacking in mass. Makes it very difficult to keep the bees and harvest and manage the inspections. So one of the ways we can take down the temperament of a colony that's constantly, and every time you go in, super defensive, is to take out the old queen and give them a new queen, or make them make another queen. The other reason a beekeeper can do a requeening is because the queens that are in the colony right now, the queen, she's not performing well, or she's failing. She's running out of, drone sperm, and she's starting to lay more and more drones, or she's got disease. There's a lot of diseases in the colony, and this is the last resort to kind of take care of the problems by changing the queen. The hope is, excuse me, that if you bring in a different queen that's going to be young and freshly mated, she will hopefully solve those issues with how much she lays, and maybe her genetics will be better as well, so that colony will be healthier. And so that's for underperforming or failing queens. That's another reason to requeen. And the third main reason a beekeeper might want to requeen their colonies is when they find out there's no queen in the colony. So that can happen for various reasons. Again, if the beekeeper crushes or injures or kills the queen, or they make a split that didn't take and there's no queen, and they're desperately in need of a queen, or they'll perish. And so there's several reasons why the beekeeper can do that for injured or dead or absent queens. And then I talked about it a little bit, but the other main reason is for combating disease and problems and failures to thrive. So some things to keep in mind. I'm going to mention that requeening is a good intervention when we have serious issues. However, it's not easy to do necessarily for the beekeeper, and it doesn't always work. So it's not something to do lightly and all the time. It's something to keep as a, well, I don't have any other options and this doesn't look good, so I'm just going to change the queen. The best idea though is to really fix the underlying causes of the problems before getting to the stage of requeening. So the other thing, we were talking about temperament, and I want to make sure that I mentioned that a colony can get very defensive sometimes, not because of their actual temperaments, but because something happened. Either there's not enough food, or there was some predators that were scratching at the hive, or ants that were bothering the colony, or you know, something happened. And so when you go into a hive and they're more defensive than usual, and it just happened overnight, that's usually not a problem with the genetics of the colony. So you don't necessarily have to requeen them. They're just defensive today. And then if that happens again another time, it might be a coincidence. And usually I will requeen the third time if they're really too defensive. But some colonies are just very defensive, and they can be producing a lot more sometimes when they're defensive. So it's something to keep in mind and to be mindful about. Yes, so if the change is overnight, chances are it's not with our genetics, it's more the environment and issues with the environment, like food, lack of food, or predators. And but on the other side, if a colony gets more and more defensive and more agitated as the time goes on, then that might be a problem with the genetics. And I want you to keep in mind also that the bigger the colony, the more defensive to tend to be, because they have more troops, they have more bees to defend, and they have more brood babies, they have more food to defend, their house is bigger, and that makes them usually more defensive to have more to protect like this. This is a close-up of what a queen cell looks like. Usually, ideally, you would want to see those in the swarming season. You're going to see those, and that's when the colony rears new queens to replace the old one that's going to leave with a bunch of the bees. So they're called queen cells, and they again look like those peanut shells. And the great part about this is that when you see a colony that's about to swarm, you can delicately cut around without being too close to the colony. So you can just kind of, maybe with a very sharp blade, cut around right there and all the way around. And then you can take very gently that queen cell and put it in a colony that needs a new queen. Okay, a colony that doesn't have a queen anymore. If it did and you're replacing it for reasons of disease, then you have to remove the old queen before you give them a queen cell. And here you could distribute 2 queen cells if you wanted, one in different colonies. You could use them for splits. Just want to make sure that if your colony is swarming, you want to leave them at least 2 or 3 cells for them to have also a queen. So this kind of like how you could cut a queen cell. This person is using a hive tool to cut underneath very delicately. You don't want to shake a queen cell. You don't want to be, you know, jostling it and moving it around too much. And you want to quickly put it in another hive so she can be taken care of by the bees. This one, if you notice, is actually open. It's not yet capped. Like these seem to be capped, and the queen is more advanced than this one. It's okay to cut them when they're young and uncapped. That's almost better. How do we requeen? Well, just always make sure to suit up carefully, because the bees don't really like that. So they get a little bit more defensive. And it's important to feel confident and comfortable so that you can concentrate on the task at hand. The second thing you can do is locate the old queen. And for that, before you get into the hive, remember that you should use very minimum amount of smoke to avoid for the queen to run, because when some queens are very good, when they smell smoke, they know something's going on. The beekeeper's probably going to come in, and they go in hiding. So don't use too much smoke. And then to find her, it's easier to find her on, I mean, she's usually going to be on the brood combs. So at the center of that ball where the babies are, you're going to want to start there to find that queen faster, and just kind of go through the bird's nest before you go through the rest. So you might have to push the bars back. You can still start in the back of the hive and look at the honeycombs first, but it's going to take a little bit longer, and that's okay. Once you find the queen, you can remove her, and usually I'm going to assume that you just don't want her anymore in this case, unless you're using it for a split and you want to keep her at that point. But let's say here you're just replacing an old queen that doesn't work, that's no good. You don't want to keep that even for a split. So at that point, you're just going to want to take her out and dispatch her. And having a jar of alcohol with a lid that fits tight, you can put her into the alcohol, like 90% proof, and then shake a little bit, and she'll die really quickly. And then you can keep those adding queens that you're pulling out that you no longer need, and put them in that alcohol, because then you can use that alcohol later to use as a swarm bait, as a swarm lure. So you can spread that inside of the colony. The alcohol will evaporate into the box. The alcohol will evaporate, and then the queen pheromones, the mandibular pheromones, will remain and attract other colonies, other swarms. So grab her and put her in alcohol, and pinch her and get rid of her. It depends what you want to do with it. And then at that point, you can use the following two options. You can either use a queen cell from a colony that wanted to swarm, so you can harvest those queen cells and give that colony that is now queenless a new swarm cell. And then if you don't have that, but that colony has eggs, then you can let them rear their own queen, understanding that half of the genetics of that new queen is going to have the genetics of the old queen. So whatever problem you are trying to fix, only half of it's probably going to be fixed, and you might have to do that a couple of times. The other thing you can do is picking a bar that has comb with eggs. Make sure there's no bees on there. Just make sure your queen stays. You can pull that bar with the comb and the eggs on it from a gentler colony that's performing well, that's healthy, and then transfer that over after you've taken the queen, or before you've taken the queen out. But either way, you're going to have to take the queen out. And at that point, if you want the new genetics, you want to get rid of the eggs of the other queen before you close back the hive. So again, if you have either the colony from which you're taking the queen doesn't have eggs, or you want new genetics, then you can take a comb from a gentle or better colony and give it to that one, making sure you remove all the eggs for them to rear. They have only one set of eggs that they can rear from, and that's going to be the kind of eggs that you want from the gentler genetics. So this is kind of the two main queen options from that. This is a technique you might be interested in using, is push-in queen cage. Sometimes the bees are not very keen on getting a queen from another colony And so if you're bringing in a queen that's already adult and already kind of, you know, or even from a queen cell, and you don't want them to destroy it, you can just put it on the comb, attach it to the comb with like a, you can push the top of the wax very gently into the other wax over a brood. This is a brood comb. And you can add a pushing queen cage. So basically what happens here is that the queen cell, and then the queen, when she emerges, is going to come out under there, and the emerging brood is going to adopt her a lot more easily than the rest of the bees that might not necessarily want her at first. So this is one option, but you don't want, if you're using a queen cell and it's not a mated queen, you don't want to leave that queen cell in there for too long, because she's going to have to go and mate within the first 10 days, preferably, of her life. Okay, so with that talk on queens and requeening and what to do when we have problems with pests and diseases, let's talk about the pests and diseases themselves, like you asked me to talk about. So if you look at this colony, actually, I just noticed there's the queen right here. She's right here. But what I'm looking at actually is a lot of signs of issues. This comb has capped brood, and it has empty cells, and it has some larvae, but it looks like those larvae is not looking very good. There's a lot of issues on this. The first set of issues is that you've got some diseased looking larvae. They're either melty, discolored, yellow, looking unhealthy. There's some black and dark spots on there. Some of the cells have been, the capped cells have been open. There's signs of issues there. So the other thing I see here is these two bees have what is called deformed wing virus. That's a disease that's expressed when the colony is not healthy. It is sometimes transmitted by Varroa Mites, and we're going to talk about those in a little bit. And so this whole look is it's looking pretty unhealthy. So I'm going to want to kind of take a look and see what I can do about this. So one of the reasons that could be causing this is a Foulbrood, which is basically when the brood gets sick and die and rots. It's putrefaction, it's rotting away. There's two kinds of Foulbroods. There's one that's really severe that will make, you know, the larvae might get capped, but they get melty and they rot. And so it creates pus kind of a thing, right? So it's all unhealthy looking. You've got swollen cappings, sunken cappings as well. You've got some pus looking things coming out, and it's just gross. And then if you put a little stick in one of those cells and it comes out ropey, kind of gum that you're pulling, then this is pretty bad, and you're going to want to probably requeen and get rid of some of those combs that are too badly gone. This, I don't know if you have it in Africa though, so it's called American Foulbrood. The other Foulbrood is European Foulbrood, and it kind of looks like what I was mentioning earlier. So anything that looks like this cruddy and discolored larvae, or larvae that you can really see the rings on them, this is a sign of an issue as well. So what to do when you see Foulbroods? Usually you want to make sure that you're using strong colonies. You don't want them to be too weak and too stressed out, and you want to use bees that are naturally going to take care of these, that are naturally resistant and naturally are going to clean the nest from this. And if they don't and the problem persists, or you know, you see this, you might want to look into requeening. That should hopefully take care of the issue for you. This kind right here, if you ever see something with that ropey thing, then that's something you probably want to get rid of the colony. Okay, so some of the issues with some of those Foulbroods or those viruses that we just talked about can be caused by Varroa mites. My understanding is that in Africa, the bees have developed their own resistance to Varroa mites because you guys didn't use pesticides in the hive like American people did. And so the bees took care of the problem themselves, which is better for them. But if you did see something like this, you either have a bad queen that was poorly mated, or you've got issues with viruses transmitted by Varroa mites, and requeening is probably your best option in both cases. Again, this is that deformed wing virus. The Varroa mites are basically those little mites that get on the bodies of the bees and feed off of their bodies and transmit diseases in the process. But usually that's not an issue when we're in period of expansion, when the colonies are growing in like January, February, March, when they're growing and getting into the nectar flow in April in Nigeria. Then you've got the population of bees is much bigger than the population of mites, and that they're not that much of an issue. However, as the population decreases towards the dry season, when the colony size decreases, and that's when the population of mites typically increases. So that creates an imbalance, and that creates a whole lot of problems. But again, in Africa, I think the bees take care of that themselves. If you do see problems with this, I would recommend making sure that you remove the queen as long as they have eggs, so that they can create another queen. Creating another queen from that's going to be an emergency, but it's going to take them about close to a month to grow another queen and for her to start laying eggs again. And that means, as you can see here, the mites, they are on the bees, but when they need to reproduce, they get into the cell just before it's capped. And when it's capped, underneath the capping, they will start reproducing in there, and they'll come out with 2 or 3 generations coming out of there. So if you take out the queen and it takes them a month for them to grow another queen, that means you don't have anybody laying eggs for 30 days or so. And that means the mites don't have anywhere to reproduce. They cannot reproduce outside of the cells. So that slows down their development as well. And sometimes that's just enough for the colony to take care of the problem. That's also why it's important to make sure that the colonies are allowed to swarm. In the United States, beekeepers tend to try to prevent the colonies to swarm so that they can, increase the size of their colonies. And I think it's a mistake. I think you should always let the colonies swarm, but you can leverage that swarming and harvest the queen and the resources before they actually cast the swarm, so that you can take it for yourself and make splits and increases of the number of colonies that you have in your apiary. This is probably a larger issue in Africa. This are small hive beetles. They are they appeared in Africa first. And they're those little tiny little scarab looking bugs that when the problem is bad, this is what they look like on the comb. They're fairly small. You can see problems with small hive beetles when you're seeing a lot of them. If you've got like hundreds of them, you have an issue with them. And the problem when you have too many of these in the hive, having 2 or 3, having 10 or 20 is not the end of the world. However, if you've got a lot, or if you have unprotected resources, these will lay eggs and they will slime up your honey and your pollen resources and potentially push the colonies to leave altogether, because this is turning into a slimed up, fermented mess that they don't want to live in. This is what their larvae look like. They're actually, they don't get any bigger than this on the combs. And what happens is, this is their life cycle. So to better understand how to stop them if you have an issue, this kind of explains what happens. It's with a Langstroth hive, but we're just going to pretend it's a barrel hive or a tabar hive. So the life cycle of the small hive beetle starts when 1 or 2 or 3 adult small hive beetle get into the hive. And that's also why it's important to make sure that there's small entrances, and then we're letting the bees control that with propolis, or we're making the entrances small without congesting the traffic. But if it's too wide open, it's allowing the small hive beetles to get in. So this is why it's important to understand this is the first step to prevent these problems, is to prevent them from getting into the hive in the first place. That means when you have a barrel hive, I would not recommend having screen on the bottom for airflow. First, it's not good for the colony to increase the airflow too much. They need to be able to control that themselves. And also, in this case, that's the door open to the small hive beetles. So we don't recommend what we call screen bottom boards or screen on the hive. They should have only one entrance, really. So once that adult gets in, or several get in, then they look for places to hide, because the bees will chase them, they'll corral them. And so they're going to go and hide where the bees cannot get them. And then when there's an opportunity, when there's not enough bees to protect the combs, when there's not, when there's a lot of food in the hive and the bees are not, catching those hive beetles, they will go and lay eggs on the comb, in the honey, and on the pollen. And then once the eggs hatch into the 4 days, then there's all those little worms that get into your pollen, into your honey, and slime it up. And ruins it. And then when they've got too many of them anyway. And then those larvae, when they're ready to pupate, they will leave through the front door of the hive and get into the ground. And then they'll spend 3 to 6 weeks to pupate, to transform into an adult. And at that point, they will emerge and start flying and get into the hives. So another reason it's important to always keep strong colonies, not colonies that are stressed or too small, if possible, or don't have enough bees to defend the wax and the brood and the food and the resources basically into the hive. That's why it's important to keep them that way, because you just want to make sure that the bees are able to cover all the combs and defend all the combs. And so it's important to keep strong colonies for that. That's the best way to get rid of them, that and breaking that cycle of not letting them enter. So we did say maintain strong and healthy hives. The other thing is you want to make sure your equipment is in good shape, it's maintained properly, and you want to make sure that there's no cracks and crevices and entrances where the small hive beetles can get in that are not guarded. And again, don't leave unprotected combs and stores exposed. But that's true in the hive for sure, but it's also true out of the hive. So when you harvest combs out of the hive for extraction of honey or for pollen or for anything, you really want to take care of extracting the honey out of them as quickly as possible, because once it's extracted, those small hive beetles larvae cannot live in liquid honey, right? So if you keep it in a bucket and wait too long, you're going to have an infestation of small hive beetles and your honey is going to be slimed and fermented and not usable. It'll be ruined. If that happens though, what you can do is put the combs in the sun to get the larvae dried out and to let the bees clean out if they want it. There might be a chance if it's too far gone that they might not even want it if it's too fermented because it's not good. But yes, right here, that's too many small hive beetles. And they're not very big, there's 3 millimeters. Another pest that you see very often in Africa and in the colonies over the world is the wax moths, the wax moth butterflies. There's 2 kinds. There's a smaller kind. It should be actually about half that size, but the picture is a picture of a smaller kind. And then you have a larger kind, the lesser wax moth and the greater wax moth. They lay their eggs, same thing, on unprotected resources, unprotected comb, either dark comb or honey. They could also do it in honeycomb or brood pollen combs. They're looking for protein, just like the small hive beetles. We're looking for protein to feed their larvae. So once they lay their eggs on unprotected resources, the larvae comes out and they start digging through the comb in the center of the comb between the 2 cells. So there's cells on both sides. In the midrib, they will tunnel through, and while they tunnel through, they'll web silk, tunnels, silk cocoon, silk protection. It makes it very hard for the bees to get rid of them and to pull them out of the comb. So pretty soon they'll take over an entire unprotected comb and cover it with webbing and frass, poop, like you can see those little dots, black dots over everywhere, and they'll eat through the wax. So that can be a problem in weak hives, but if you keep strong hives, again, they will keep those pests at bay and control them for you. The small hive beetles and the wax moths, and to a certain extent, the Varroa mites, are all a symptom of an underlying problem. There's an issue with the colony to start with. It's usually because it's weak and unable to defend itself and take care of itself. So in the case of the wax moth, they are basically the vultures that are going to clean out the bones of the colony, and that they are useful because if they were not there to clean out this old comb that's dirty and filled with probably diseases because it's been used over and over again and it's not clean anymore, then the bees couldn't rear their babies into clean comb. So the wax moth destroys the entire comb, leaves it empty, and then the bees can rebuild anew with fresh comb. So there are vultures that are cleaning out the old nasty combs and making space for the bees to rebuild. Sometimes though, if the colony is too weak, that will spell the doom of the colony and they will finish it off. But the problem was already there. That's why they were weak. And how to control wax moth? Again, maintain strong and healthy hives. Maintain your equipment. Make sure there's no cracks and crevices and other places for them to get in. Don't leave unprotected combs and stores exposed. Same thing. Even if it doesn't have honey or pollen, you just want to make sure that if you're, for any reason, you've got too many combs, your colony was not big enough to guard it, you're pulling out that old comb, and at that point you have 2 choices. You can either give it to another colony that's strong enough to take care of it, or you can just cut it out and melt it in the solar wax melter or the whichever way you want to melt your wax. and do the work that the wax moths would have done otherwise, but then you get to keep the wax, because this kind of wax is not going to be usable. It's destroyed. There's no more value to it. If you catch it before they do this, you could melt it and use it for all kinds of things. And then the last pest I wanted to talk about is the ants. That's a problem with, well, I was going to talk about the termites briefly as well, but the ants are a problem because they can crawl into very, very small holes. And once they have noticed there's a colony of honeybees with honey and pollen, which both are very rich sources of food for ants as well, they will get in, and the bees have a hard time controlling them because they're so small and there's so many of them. And so they just kind of help themselves and leave without any problems. So the best way to control the ants is to make sure you don't have long grasses or branches that are touching your hive and then blocking access on the ground contact as well. So you want to isolate the hive so that the ants cannot get to the hive. And so this is just an idea of a ant guard that you can use. You can use a can with some oil in it, fill it in oil, put maybe like a rock or a brick, and another can that's bigger upside down to be used as a rain cover. And you can do that on all the legs, the same system, and then place your hive on top. And then basically the ants that are crawling are trying to get into the hive. They'll crawl here, and here they'll crawl down and they'll find oil. So they're not going to be able to cross that oil barrier. And at that point, they cannot get into the hive. The other way to do this is to rub motor oil on the legs, all of the legs, to prevent access as well. But in that case, that needs to be reapplied more often. This one upside down is used as a rain cover, so that's why it's upside down, because if there's water going into the oil, eventually it will go over. And we don't want any leaves to make a bridge for the ants either. So this is an idea of how you can avoid ants getting into the hives. You can do that with paper cups. You can do that with water bottles, like the plastic bottles. You can do that with all kinds of things. You can recycle those to do that. So with that being said, the other pests that can be an issue is the termites, and termites can eat through the woods. So I think that the ant guard that we just described can help with that as well, because that makes for an obstacle that they cannot cross either. You also want to make sure there's no branches touching the hive for them to use as a bridge to get on. You can also suspend the hives and put grease on the suspensions using strong wires or strong cords. You can suspend them to trees if you don't want them to have legs, and that's one way to do it. You just don't want to put them up too high so that you cannot manage them. And I think that's the most of it. If you do have honey badgers, that's also something you want to make sure that they're probably suspended or on legs higher off the ground like you have them right now, and so that the badgers cannot roll the hives and try to get in. But keep the hives closed as much as possible. There's also the issue with robbing. Other bees can be an issue, right? Because when you're opening a hive and there's not enough food in the season, when it's like a dry season or dearth, when there's not enough nectar, bees want to take each other's honey stores if they can. So it's important to not leave your hives open too long in that period. I think that's about it for pests and diseases. So if I come up with something else, I'll let you know. Thank you so much. And let me know if you have any questions.